husband mentioned that he was craving Coca-Cola the other day, and since we were out of soda, I decided to make him some today. I started by making my caramel sugar by combining some water and sugar, letting that come to the hard crack stage before pouring it out and letting it cool. Once it was all cooled down, I broke it up and set it aside and moved on to zesting my citrus. I started by zesting some oranges, some lemon, and lastly, I also zested some lime. I moved on to grinding up all of my spices. I started by combining some nutmeg, cinnamon, some vanilla, coriander seeds, rose hips, some lime leaves, and some cola nut. Before grinding that into a fine powder, I combined the last round of ingredients, which were some water with different sugars, the citrus that we zested earlier, and we can't forget about our citric and malic acid, and also the caramel sugar we made earlier. I set that into a water bath and let that all come together for about an hour and a half on the stove before straining it through a fine mesh strainer. I popped that in the fridge until it was cold, and then it was time to have our soda. I combined some cola syrup with sparkling water, and this tasted exactly like Coke. And when I made Lucky a glass, he was so impressed that he had to have another glass after. When my toddlers asked me for candy this morning, specifically the peach and apple ring gummies, I decided to just make them some. I started by blanching some peaches and then shocking them in an ice bath after to get the skin off. I then peeled all 4 of my peaches and made sure to get the skin off without taking any of the flesh with it. After that, I gave them a rough chop before adding them to my blender alongside some orange. Once that was blended up, I passed that through a fine mesh strainer, added some honey and some gelatin. I let that bloom while I got started on cutting up my apples. I used a variation of Granny Smith and Honey Crisp. Once those were all chopped up, I put them through my juicer, which always reminds me of the time I used to work at a smoothie shop. I then strained my apple juice and added some lemon, a smidge of spirulina, but be sparing with it. And then I sprinkled on some gelatin for it to bloom. I returned both pots to the stove and heated them up until they became liquid, and then poured them into my silicone molds. Placed these in the fridge for a few hours and then got started on my citric acid and sugar mixture. Once my gummies were ready, I coated them in this, and these were gone before I could even plate them up. I couldn't sleep last night and realized that I had a head of Napa cabbage in the fridge and hadn't made kimchi in a while, so I decided to go downstairs and do exactly that. I cut my cabbage into quarters and took the core out before slicing it into smaller pieces. I repeated that with each quarter and put them in a large bowl, sprinkled them with salt, massaged my cabbage, and then topped it with water. I put a plate on top to make it a little heavier, and then let that sit for about 2 hours. After about 2 hours, I poured all that water out and rinsed it a couple times before letting it sit in my strainer while I prepped my marinade. I grated some garlic, ginger, put that back in the bowl with some fish sauce, a sprinkle of sugar, and some red chili flakes before giving that a good mix. While that was sitting and getting to know each other, I peeled my daikon radish and sliced it into matchsticks before moving on to cutting up some spring onions. Once all my prep was done, I put all of my vegetables into my large bowl and started mixing that really well, making sure to get everything coated evenly. I then started filling it into my jar. I had to try a little bit just to make sure it was perfect. Then I screwed the lid on and let it stand for 4 days at room temperature to ferment. My husband has a weird obsession with Takis and can't go longer than a week without having them. When he opened his bag of Takis today, he realized that they all went stale, so I just decided to make him some. I combined some corn flour with some water, salt, and some sugar before kneading it and letting it hydrate while I made my spice mixture. I combined habanero powder with cayenne pepper, paprika, citric acid, some red beet coloring to give it that really red color before setting that aside and dividing my dough into dime-sized pieces and rolling them into little balls. Once they were all rolled out, I made sure to cover them with a damp towel while I worked on one piece at a time. I put my dough in between some plastic before pressing it flat and rolling it into that signature Taki shape. And I kept repeating this process with all of my little pieces of dough. I then transferred them over to a plate while my oil was heating up. I made sure it reached 350 degrees before putting all of my chips in there and letting them get slightly more brown than I usually would. I tossed them in my spice mixture and then they were done. Since Takis are Lucky's favorite snack, he was so excited to try them and he was so shocked at how much they tasted like the actual thing, and that plate was gone in under 5 minutes. Rumble and Slim aren't big snackers, but when they do request something, I usually make it. So today they requested some chips and guacamole and some popsicles. I got started on making my dough for my tortillas by combining some corn flour with some warm water before forming them into little balls and pressing them flat. I placed them in a hot skillet and fried them until they puffed up, and then transferred them over to a kitchen towel to keep them warm. In the meantime, I moved on to making my popsicles. I decided to make some lemon basil popsicles, so I juiced all of my lemons before moving on to making my simple syrup by combining some water, sugar, and a splash of maple syrup. I let that come to a boil, and while that was boiling, I finally chopped my basil. Once my mixture came to room temperature, I poured in my lemon juice and my basil before transferring it over to popsicle molds. Put the lid on top and popped these in the freezer for about 3 to 4 hours. And in the meantime, got started on making my guacamole. I mashed up some avocado and kept the pits in to keep it fresh before squeezing on some lime juice. I chopped up some tomatoes, some onions, and cilantro before putting all of that in the bowl with my avocado. I seasoned it with some salt, cumin, and some more lime juice before giving that a good mix, making sure everything is combined. At this point, I cut up my tortillas and fried them until they were golden brown, and while they were still hot, I sprinkled them with some salt. My kids couldn't wait, so I got the popsicles out and gave them one before plating the chips, and they absolutely loved it. My husband hasn't been home in a few days, but he's going to be home in about 4 hours. So I decided to surprise him with a variation of one of his favorite desserts, which are cinnamon rolls. I had a bunch of raspberries at home, so I decided to make some raspberry lemon rolls. I started with my dough by combining some milk, sugar, butter, eggs, and then gradually adding in my flour. I made sure to mix it very well until it was all combined before pouring it out onto my counter and starting to knead it. I kneaded it for about 8 to 10 minutes until it was all smooth and came together before placing it in a bowl to rise. After about 2 hours, it had doubled in size, so I released all the air and then started on my filling. We kept this very simple with some brown sugar, cornstarch, and some frozen raspberries. Gave that a mix before sprinkling that all over my dough. I tried to get it as even as possible and then rolled it up and sliced it into equal pieces. I buttered my baking tray and placed my rolls inside, making sure that they weren't too close to each other, before covering them in cling film and letting them rise for another hour and a half. At this point, I preheated my oven and placed some more raspberries on top of my rolls before popping them in the oven for about 30 minutes. Baked them until they were golden brown and let them cool while I started on my frosting, which was some cream cheese, milk, powdered sugar, lemon zest, vanilla, and a squeeze of lemon juice. I mixed that all up and then spread that on top of my rolls. 30 minutes later, Lucky walked through the door, so it was perfect timing. I plated him one and he absolutely loved it. My baby just got home from the hospital, and one thing that she has been asking me to make is chicken noodle soup. So today I decided to make it for her. I started by making my stock, so I cut up some carrots, some onions, some celery, and set that aside while I got a big pot out to put my chicken in. I use the whole chicken, but you can add whatever parts of the chicken you have laying around. I add all of my vegetables to the pot alongside some herbs and also a few cloves of garlic. I fill up my pot with some cold water before putting the lid on and letting that simmer away. After about an hour, I pull out my chicken and get the meat off, shred the meat and set that aside, and return the carcass back to my broth to simmer for another hour or two. Once that was almost done, I started on my soup. I sliced up some celery, some carrots, and also diced up some onion. At this point, it was time to strain my broth, so I used a fine mesh strainer to get everything out. And then I added my vegetables to a separate pot Sauteed them for a couple minutes before adding my broth and letting that simmer. In the meantime, I got started on making my egg noodles. I combined some eggs, some milk, whisked that up before adding some flour and then kneading my dough until it came together. I let that rest for about 10 minutes before rolling it out and cutting it into little squares, or might I say rectangles. I dropped them into my hot soup, let them boil for about 2 minutes before it was time to plate. I topped it with some parsley and lemon, and she absolutely loved it. My parents are on a 10-hour flight over from Germany and they're about to land, so I decided to make them an early dinner for when they arrive at our house. Our friends brought us these potatoes from Idaho, so I thought it would be perfect making a duck fat roasted potato. I started by chopping them and boiling them while I got started on my maple roasted carrots. I cut my rainbow carrots in half and seasoned them with some olive oil, maple syrup, and some other spices. At this point, my potatoes were parboiled. I shook them up and transferred them over to a baking sheet with some hot duck fat before roasting them for about an hour in the oven. In the meantime, I got started on making a cilantro hummus and plated that before popping that in the fridge. Once that was set aside, I made my variation of a gremolata and added some green olives, dill, parsley, and also a red plum. I finally chopped my parsley and my dill before moving on to my olives and adding them to the plate. Last but not least, I also cut up my plum and added some olive oil, lemon juice, and some grated garlic to the mix. Seasoned with salt and pepper, gave that a good stir. By this point, my fish was ready to go in the oven, so I got started on the marinade, which was just some melted butter, some lemon juice, and a handful of other spices to go with the fish. Coated my fish in the marinade before putting it on a baking sheet and adding some tomatoes to roast as well. At this point, I was ready to plate, so I put my maple roasted carrots down on my cilantro hummus, topped my fish with some of the gremolata, but also put some extra on the side, plated my potatoes as well, and there we go, dinner was served. My dad loves a good potato while my mom loves a well-cooked fish, so this was perfect. My husband's about to go on a 25-hour road trip, so I decided to make him some bubblegum lollipops as a little treat on his drive. Started out by making my bubblegum by spreading some powdered sugar on some wax paper, melting down my gum base, transferring that into the middle of my mounds I created. I added some apple flavor to one of them and added some vanilla extract to the other to make two different kinds of flavors before kneading in my powdered sugar. Once a good portion of them was absorbed, I cut them up and formed them into little gum balls before putting them aside while I got started on making my lollipops. Obviously had to try one and make sure that it was the right consistency, which it was. I then moved on to making my lollipops by combining some sugar and syrup in a pot before placing that on my stove to boil. In the meantime, I put my gum balls on top of my lollipop sticks before checking on my sugar mixture on the stove. I wanted to keep a close eye on it to make sure it reached the right temperature before adding in some more apple syrup and green food coloring since I was making apple flavored lollipops. Once it reached the hard crack stage, I transferred it over to my silicone molds before placing my lollipop sticks inside. To speed up the cooling process, I placed them in the fridge and then had Lucky get them out of the molds because I couldn't for some reason. He got them out and couldn't contain his excitement, so he tried one of them and absolutely loved them. I wrapped up the other ones so he could take them on his road trip. My kids aren't big snackers, but today they requested some Cheez-Its after seeing them at the store the other day, so I decided to just make them some. These are super simple and quick to make, so I started off by shredding some cheddar cheese, combining that in my stand mixer with some salt and butter. I then mix it all until it's pretty much combined before adding in some flour and some really cold water. Once that all comes together, I form it into a disc and spread it on some plastic wrap before popping it in the fridge for about an hour and a half. After it's chilled, I pull it back out. Usually I cut it in half so it's easier to handle before using my rolling pin to get it as thin as I can. I then slice it in whatever shape I want. Usually it's tiny rectangles or squares. Place those on a parchment-lined baking tray before using the end of a chopstick to put a small hole in the middle so they resemble Cheez-Its. After I've done that with all of them, I pop them in the oven for about 10 minutes, let them cool, and then place them in my glass jar. That's how I usually store them, but my kids had all of these in one sitting.